Let's talk about the Great Depression in 1929. But before we get into that, let me give you some context about the economy of the 1920s. Throughout the 1920s, the US economy expanded rapidly, and the nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, a period called the Roaring Twenties. The stock market centered around the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street in New York City, where everyone from millionaire tycoons to cooks or janitors poured their savings into the stocks. As a result, the stock market underwent rapid expansion in August 1929. By then, production had rapidly declined and unemployment had risen, leaving stock prices higher than their actual value. Additionally, wages at the time were low and consumer debt was proliferating. And on top of that, the agricultural sector of the economy was struggling due to drought and falling food prices with surplus crops. And banks had excess of large loans that could not be liquidated. So the American economy entered a mild recession during the summer of 1929. Consumer spending slowed down and unsold goods began to pile up. This caused factories to not be able to produce as much products as they would like to sell because nobody was buying them. And with consumers not buying, the rate of factory production went down. Nonetheless, the stock prices continued to rise. And by the fall of that year, stock market prices reached stratospheric levels that could not be justified by expected future earnings. So let's get to the crash of 1929. On October 24th, 1929, as nervous investors began selling overpriced shares in masses, the thing that people feared happened at last. The stock market crashed. A record 12.9 million shares were traded that day, known as Black Thursday. 5 days later, on October 29th, known as Black Tuesday, around 16 million shares were traded. Millions of shares ended up worthless, and those investors who have bought stocks on margin were wiped out completely. Many Americans forced to buy on credit fell into debt, and the number of foreclosures and repossessions climbed steadily. The global adherence to the gold standard, which joined countries around the world to fix currency exchange, helped spread economic woes from the United States throughout the world, especially in Europe. Now let's talk about bank runs and the Hoover administration. Despite assurances from President Hoover and other leaders that the crisis would run its course, matters continued to get worse over the next 3 years by 1930. 4 million Americans looking for work could not find it. That number had risen to 6 million in 1931. Meanwhile, the country's industrial production had dropped by half. Bread lines, soup kitchens, and rising numbers of homeless people became more and more common to Americans' towns and cities. Farmers couldn't afford to harvest their crops, and they were forced to leave them rotting, while people in other places starved. Severe droughts in the southern plains brought high winds and dust from Texas to Nebraska, killing people, livestock, and crops. The Dust Bowl inspired mass migration of people from farmland to cities in search of work. In the fall of 1930, the first 4 waves of banking panics began. As large numbers of investors lose confidence in the solvency of their banks, they demanded deposits in cash. This forced banks to liquidate loans in order to supplement their insufficient cash reserves on hand. Now let's talk about bank runs. A bank run or run on the bank occurs when many clients withdraw their money from the bank because they believe that the bank may cease function in the near future. So the bank run swept the United States again in the spring and fall of 1931 and the fall of 1932. And by early 1933, thousands of banks closed their doors. Now in 1932, the next election was coming up, with the Republican Party, Herbert Hoover, and the Democratic Party, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it turns out Franklin D. Roosevelt won the election by a landslide. During Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, his administration passed legislation that aimed to stabilize industrial and agricultural production, create jobs, and stimulate recovery. In addition, Roosevelt sought to reform the financial system, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to protect depositors' accounts, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses of the kind that led to the 1929 crash. And now the next year, 1933, Roosevelt enacted the New Deal, which was a series of programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations. Among the programs and institutions of the New Deal that aided the recovery of the Great Depression was the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which built dams and hydroelectric projects to control flooding and provide electric power to the impoverished Tennessee Valley region. In the Works Progress Administration, WPA, a permanent job program that employed 8.5 million people from 1935 to 1943. So when the Great Depression began, the United States was the only industrialized country in the world without some form of unemployment insurance or Social Security. In 1935, Congress passed the Social Security Act, which for the first time provided Americans with unemployment, disability, and pensions for old age. Now, after showing early signs of recovery beginning in the spring of 1933, the economy continued to improve throughout the next 3 years, during which the GDP, Gross Domestic Product, a comprehensive measure of the U.S. economic activity, grew at an average rate of 9% per year. Jumping ahead to 1941, the Great Depression ends and World War II begins. With Roosevelt's decision to support Great Britain and France in the struggle against Germany and the other Axis powers, defense manufacturing geared up, producing more and more private sector jobs. In December 1941, the Japanese attacked America, and the nation's factories went back into full production mode. So this expanding industrial production, as well as the widespread conscription beginning in 1942, reduced the unemployment rate to below its pre-depression level. So the Great Depression had ended at last, and the United States turned its attention to the global conflict of World War II.